According to some thinkers, dreaming distinguishes humans from animals. It opens the door to the future and helps man evolve. As knowledge grows, dreams continue to expand its limits. Modern society, built on science and technology, depends on these dreams. When a dreamer is fascinated with technology, he often becomes a visionary. Sometimes these visionaries force society to redefine what is possible by rejecting the unattainable. The dream of space travel took shape when technology was still in its infancy. Some engineers were developing automobiles, while others were dreaming of interplanetary travel. When the internal combustion engine was bogged down in difficulties, certain visionaries were designing jet engines. The Russian visionary Konstantin Tsiolkovsky put humanity on the road to the cosmos. Born in 1857, he grew up in the feudal, almost medieval society of the Russian Tsars. An obscure teacher in a small Russian village, Tsiolkovsky spent his entire life researching aeronautics and astronautics. He got up early and devoted a few hours to scientific research before going to the local village school to teach children arithmetic. He always worked outside official scientific circles, and his exceptional contribution was only recognized towards the end of his life. Tsiolkovsky was primarily interested in aviation. Fascinated by birds, he tried to analyze their flight scientifically. He simulated it by using clever models which he tested in a small wind tunnel. His models are fascinating, and their aerodynamic design is still exemplary today. But Tsiolkovsky didn't just dream about flying over forests or mountains. He foresaw the day when humans would leave the Earth and travel to other planets. Our planet may be the cradle of intelligence, he used to like saying, but one cannot spend his life in a cradle. He knew jet engines were required to move in a void. As early as 1903, he described in detail his concept of a rocket, including several phases of propulsion. He also designed a spacesuit which would enable cosmonauts to leave their spaceship and move around in the void. Tsiolkovsky was a visionary who perceived the principal problems posed by space travel and proposed solutions for virtually every one of them. In October 1917, Tsiolkovsky was 60 years old. Probably more concerned with his own work than with the revolution, he nevertheless became the symbol of a popular science. After spending his life in poverty and obscurity, Stalin's Russia honored him with a splendid state funeral. Tsiolkovsky was not the only one dreaming about rocket travel in space at the turn of the century. Somewhere in Massachusetts, the American Robert Goddard shared the same dream. He was completely unaware of his isolated Russian counterpart. Who knows what would have happened if these two pioneers had met? The difference between Goddard and Tsiolkovsky was that Goddard was an accomplished theoretician and meticulous inventor. He, however, wasn't forced to use homemade models like his Russian colleague. In 1926, more than 15 years before the German V-2s were built, Goddard developed and flew the first liquid-fueled rocket. In 1930, his machines were launched at a test center in New Mexico, where there was no risk of fallout. While there, he developed ingenious technical solutions and improved his rockets. Virtually the only person in the United States interested in developing rockets, he maintained his perseverance. Official scientific circles and public opinion were not interested in activities which they regarded as little more than a dangerous pastime. It could very well have taken much longer before anyone started to take seriously Goddard's dream of launching humans into space. Like the other pioneers of the space age, Hermann Oberth had to wait years and endure countless rejections before his work was acknowledged. Born in Transylvania, Oberth was 20 years old when the First World War broke out. He interrupted his studies to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army. While there, he designed a long-range missile propelled by a liquid-fueled rocket. The War Ministry dismissed his project as pure fantasy. After the war, in 1922, he elaborated his ideas in a doctoral thesis at the renowned Heidelberg University. It was also rejected. Refusing to admit defeat, Oberth published the results himself. The book brought him fame and a university position. It was during this period he began his association with Werner von Braun, a young German engineer. Von Braun had come to offer his services. Once again, war upset Oberth's life. After Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, he was assigned to the Peenemünde Research Center. He was placed under the supervision of Werner von Braun and worked on the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which he had proposed 25 years earlier, during another war. Still under the supervision of von Braun, Oberth worked on the American space program from 1955 to 1958. In 1958, he returned to Germany to retire.
Eine erhebliche Begeisterung für die Astronautik. Ich habe natürlich Ihr Buch gelesen.
Von Braun paid homage to his former teacher when American astronauts first landed on the moon in 1969.
Maschinen nun. Solche Bedingungen können in einigen Jahrzehnten eintreten.
Autographs of the entire Apollo 11 crew appear in Hermann Oberth's first work, The Rocket in Interplanetary Space.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger 20.
Through Oberth, Armstrong, and von Braun, the dream of going into space became reality. Von Braun discovered the book when he was 13 years old. From that day on, he dreamt of space travel and interplanetary rockets. By the time he turned 22 in 1934, he had already built and launched 2 rockets, which climbed several kilometers. He was named the technical director in charge of developing the V-1 and V-2 rockets at Peenemünde. The German Army was well aware of the military value of these rockets. While the United States gave Goddard a research grant of $10,000, the German Army invested more than $100 million into building the Peenemünde Research Center. With this kind of funding, von Braun and his team would give Germany a head start in space research. At the end of the war, von Braun and 100 or so researchers from Peenemünde surrendered to the Americans, who also recovered several of the V-2 rockets. Within a few months, the whole group resumed its research, this time at the White Sands base in New Mexico. In 1952, von Braun became the technical director of the ballistic weapons program of the U.S. Army. On January 31st, 1958, his team launched the first American satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. Even though he worked on the development of ballistic weapons, both in Germany and in the United States, von Braun always promoted the idea of manned space flights. In the 50s, he published several articles and books and gave numerous lectures to promote manned space travel. They failed to stir any interest among politicians or the military. Von Braun, however, was eloquent and persuasive and eventually came to represent both the dream and the very means of realizing it.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The challenge of space travel was presented to the world. Von Braun was the perfect candidate for building the giant rocket essential to its success. The Saturn V, designed by von Braun, finally carried Neil Armstrong to the moon 8 years later. Unlike von Braun, who was always in the limelight, Sergei Korolev remained unknown in the country of his birth until he died in 1966. For strategic reasons, Soviet authorities went so far as to hide the existence of their space program's chief designer. Korolev, however, was the inspiration and mastermind behind Soviet rockets and spacecraft for more than 20 years. Under his direction, the Soviets moved ahead of the United States in the space race by launching Sputnik 1 and Yuri Gagarin beyond the Earth's atmosphere. When he was a child, Korolev was fascinated by the exploits of Soviet aviators. Years later, as a student, he built gliders, which he flew himself. Later, he developed an interest in liquid fuel rockets. During the Second World War, he concentrated his energies on developing the jet engine. And in 1940, he managed to successfully launch a prototype of a jet plane. The USSR also recovered several of the V-2s built by the Germans. After the war, they developed more and more powerful rockets. Korolev built numerous missiles capable of reaching the upper atmosphere and attaining the speed required to launch satellites. On October 4th, 1957, 100 years to the day after the birth of Tsiolkovsky, Sputnik was launched. Its success astounded the world and made the Americans realize they had fallen behind the Soviets in the race for space. Indeed, the Korolev rocket was more powerful than anything the Americans were capable of launching at the time. The first tests of Korolev's rocket often ended in spectacular failure. Despite everything, it quickly became a reliable and versatile instrument. Today, this rocket, known as the Samyorka, is the foundation of the Soviet space program. In April 1956, Korolev suggested that a human be put on board the rocket. 5 years later, his dream became reality. Yuri Gagarin was training to become the first man to leave the Earth's atmosphere. The mission was shrouded in secrecy, and there was no public announcement of the launching. On the morning of April 12th, 1961, everything was ready.
Говорит Москва. Работают все радиостанции Советского Союза. Московское время 10 часов 2 минуты. Передаем сообщение ТАСС о первом в мире полете человека в космическое пространство. 12 апреля 1961 года в Советском Союзе выведен на орбиту вокруг Земли первый в мире космический корабль-спутник «Восток» с человеком на борту. Пилотом-космонавтом космического корабля «Спутника Восток» является гражданин Союза Советских Социалистических Республик, летчик-майор Гагарин Юрий Алексеевич.
Кедр, я Заря-1.
Заря-1, я Кедр. Вас понял, за ответом прием.
Ключ за 13. Ключ за 13. Есть 12.
The epic flight went perfectly, and Yuri Gagarin became the first human to leave the Earth. Circling the Earth in 108 minutes, he plunged back into the atmosphere and landed gently on the ground. Completely unknown before squeezing into the cramped capsule, he became an international hero almost instantaneously after opening the doors to the universe. The historic flight of Vostok 1 proved that a human being could survive a state of weightlessness. The flight also confirmed that Soviet technology had matured and could carry out such missions in relative safety. Korolev had masterminded the success and the lead which the Soviets maintained over the Americans for the next few years. He proposed a series of technological objectives which would ensure the long-term development of space science in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, however, favored more spectacular missions. He wanted more records or firsts. The death of Korolev in 1966, after an unsuccessful operation, marked a turning point in the Soviet space program. His death coincided with the beginning of a black period for the program. Suddenly, the Soviets were plagued by delayed missions and tremendous failures. At the same time, Yuri Gagarin's death marked an important moment in Soviet history. When his plane crashed on March 24, 1968, he was only 34 years old. He embodied the ideals of advanced socialism and became a mythical hero. Today, he is still an inspiration and model for Soviet citizens. Whether from an American or Soviet perspective, Gagarin was a hero to early astronauts. With his military training, his outstanding record as a test pilot, and his nerves of steel, he represented the pride and ideals of a nation. Hundreds of people from dozens of countries have followed Gagarin into space. These cosmic travelers, however, have changed in the last quarter century. The astronaut no longer has to be a Superman. Today, they are specialists who go into space to carry out research. Each crew member is trained for a special task, either to pilot the spaceship, operate various instruments, or conduct scientific experiments. The colonizers have taken over from the explorers. 50 years after Tsiolkovsky's death, the dreams of a humble village teacher have become reality. All that is but one. Tsiolkovsky was sure that when the universe was conquered, that humanity too would be perfect.